I'm happy to welcome Per Backlund, who's a professor of informatics and co-founder of the Serious Games Master Program at University of Skövde in Sweden. He's interested in the development and application of serious games in education, vocational training, traffic education, and rehabilitation. Now, of course, Per will guide the topic. I just want to introduce a couple of Wittgensteinian questions here. In his work, Per has mentioned the fact that Wittgenstein particularly chose game as the ambiguous feature of language in general. But one of the things I hope that Per will tell us is what is a game and what is serious. Wittgenstein had great difficulty. In fact, he suggested that it was fundamental in finding what it is that all things have in common that merit being called games. That's what led him to his idea that there isn't anything that all games have in common. In fact, there's nothing that the reference of any words have in common. An interesting question at this point is to ask what the relation is between games and designing games and sports, because sport is also a difficult thing to define. It's an artifact. It's a kind of thing that humans do. With other kinds of categories, we determine what their features are, what their distinguishing features are objectively. I always use the example of mushrooms. I mean, it's not up to human beings to decide which mushrooms are safe for them to eat and which ones are not safe for them to eat. This is called supervised learning. If you eat something and it makes you sick, probably you should stop eating it. The criterion is outside of the categorizer. But in the case of games, we are the criterion. We decide what we consider to be a game. Things like virtual reality come to mind as well. So I'm wondering to what extent these general considerations will arise in there will no doubt be in Per's talk focused questions about how to actually go ahead and, having settled what a serious game is, how to go about designing them. Per, I pass it to you.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me to this seminar series. I'm honored to participate. So just a few words. My background is in a more traditional type of informatics, business informatics, information systems and such. But I switched interest, and I have been an active researcher in serious games since 2005, when I started with a couple of colleagues to build research around computer games in general and serious games in particular at our university. So my specific focus and interest is on organizational implementation and usefulness of games, and that, I guess, comes a bit with my background in informatics. So I'm not a good game designer per se. I'm more on the other side of serious games. I'll come back to that, I guess. And apart from doing research projects, I'm also the administrator and a teacher in one of our master programs, which is focusing on serious games. A few words about my place. I'm located in the west of Sweden. If you know anything about Sweden, we're quite close to the second biggest city, Gothenburg. We're a small place, small university, but we're actually the biggest academic educator in computer games in Sweden. And with that also, we do quite a fair share of research coming with that. We have been doing this for almost 20 years now. In fact, we started our first bachelor program in game development in 2002. Then we admitted 30 students studying some sort of combination of game design and programming. It soon became very successful. And since then, we have expanded a lot on that. So now we do have a strong focus on game development on our school, the School of Informatics. We have, I don't know, 500, 600 students studying game development in total. And that includes actually a variety of competencies, everything from programming, game design, to the more artistic side, such as 2D graphics, 3D graphics, game writing, sound and music. And we also run 4 study programs on advanced level with different specializations. And if you're enrolled in our PhD school, you can also focus on games for that topic. Moving on then to the reason that I was invited. I actually kind of regret it now after your introduction that I removed the 1 or 2 slides about definitions of games. So I did that deliberately because I thought that I would move to the area which is closer to me and closer to what I do. So, as I said, we started early with education in games. And we soon, myself and a few colleagues, we soon got a strategic mission to build research relating to games. And at the time, when we started to look for funding, it turned out that it was much easier to get funding for serious games projects. That is, the question was always, okay, games, interesting, but what are they good for? What are they useful for? What can you use them for? And that led us to much work in serious games area. Since we wanted to have games and game development as a starting point, we ended up with a pretty open and inclusive view of what we think serious games are, as you can see on this slide. So it pretty much includes all sorts of applications of games or game technology or game thinking, if you want to use it for an additional, typically a non-entertainment purpose. We have kind of stuck to that since then. And it has served us well because we can use it to convince the management and university of certain things that are useful for us. So we didn't really put much more attention to that in that sense, in the more philosophical sense of games. We rather moved quite quickly on to the practical applications and the practical development of games and such. So as I said, my background is in more traditional IS, and as you may be aware of, there is a rich body of knowledge addressing the development of that class of systems, information systems development, different types of utility systems for organizational effectiveness on all sorts of levels. And some of the keywords that I just wanted to point to there, that we typically think of IT-based system, even though obviously they don't have to be. We think that utility and organizational value is, of course, an important thing. And we also like to stress the human in the loop, that humans are parts of these systems. Humans are the users of these kinds of IT systems. So with that background, it seemed reasonable for me to look at serious games as well when I was approached with that opportunity from colleagues working in games. So I guess that what we think of when we say serious games may be illustrated like this. We think of games as solutions to some organizational problem. And my interpretation, and definitely the interpretation of many of my colleagues is that we seem to lean too much towards the serious part rather than the game part. So meaning that serious games are possibly too serious. Also, from my background in information systems, I would like to point to one of the well-known scholars there, Juhani Ivari from Finland, who has spent a lot of work together with several colleagues to think of what is the body of knowledge for information systems development. What do you need to know and understand to develop information systems? So he concluded in this figure in one of his papers, the IS body of knowledge, that there are different ontological domains, knowledge domains that you need to cover. So the domain of IS development processes, that is how do you develop these class of systems? What are the tools, the techniques, the methods and approaches that you use? And that one is classified as one of the core competence areas for IS developers. It's talking about the IS application knowledge, which is associated with the kind of typical IT applications and their use in a given domain, which is also by Ivari classified as a core competence. Then you have the application domain knowledge, which is associated with the domain for which the system is built. And this is information and knowledge that is most likely to reside with also the domain experts working in the domain. And it has to be absorbed into the development process somehow for an IS system. And technology knowledge associated with the typical types of hardware and software and how they may be applied to those different application domains. And that's, of course, computers and operating systems and whatnot. And then all is set in an organizational setting, organizational knowledge, which is associated with all the social and economic processes of an organization in which the system is used. So this also includes the humans and the different stakeholders, typically referred to as users or developers or managers or so. But a game is a game in our view, and then some other characteristics come into play. If you look at the work of scholars like Johan Huizinga or Calois, you rather see descriptions like this, that a game is a voluntary and enjoyable activity. It's somehow separate from the real world. It's unproductive in the sense that it should not produce any goods or external value. It's an important part of human culture, important social function, and above all, it's a meaningful activity in its own right. And maybe better illustrated like this. But then what is a serious game? When we try to combine these two spheres, and that is what I am particularly interested in, and what we have been particularly interested in our work in the area of serious games. What happens when you introduce and combine these two spheres, the utility, productivity sphere and games? Is there a conflict between the unproductiveness and enjoyability and voluntariness as opposed to serious games, which are more about effectiveness and usefulness and in some cases to improve productivity? And yeah, of course, productivity and, well, the utility aspect is important because that would be the whole point of having a serious game. But it also is implied that if you introduce the notion of games into the productivity sphere, something else happens. So this is the things that we want to explore, and we have done that with a quite strong focus on design science research. So we've tried to find problems that are relevant to businesses or organizations, and we have been very interested in building artifacts, serious games, and in testing them in real context. So we paid much effort into moving into the places where the games are actually used with the real users. So along with that, we have also strived to take game development as a starting point when doing that. And much like IS development, game development is multidisciplinary in itself. And you can see that from the games research landscape, which clearly reflects this multidisciplinarity. And in fact, several scholars in the area point to the necessity of interdisciplinarity or multidisciplinarity to have any deeper understanding of games, of digital games. So in that sense, some people say, yes, digital games are software products. And sure, aspects of game development and game development processes have been somewhat addressed in the IS community, for example, when viewed as a software product. But we also feel very strongly that a digital game is not only a software product, it's so much more, and it seems hard to capture all these aspects within a single topic, and especially within a single topic oriented only towards technology. So this means that there are several creative aspects of game development that somehow complicate the development process, and maybe illustrated like this. That apart from the type of developers that you would expect in any IT project, you also have the aspect of artistic and creative expression when it comes to games in the form of audio designers, art, writing. This is all about creating the experience, the play experience, the game play experience of games, rather than gearing towards productivity. And that role is quite often in game development projects held by a producer. So maybe that is partly borrowed from film industry in that sense.
I have a question for you, Per.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
In this community that you describe, in this population that you describe of contributors on this page, what seems to be missing is the users and their cognition.
Yeah, we'll come to that, I guess. Thank you for pointing it out. So when we have looked at this, we're missing some things. We miss game design knowledge in the IS sphere, as you may remember from the EVARI conceptualization that was not included. And we also have another view of the users. We typically refer to them as players with different expectations. And in serious games, of course, the users are potentially players and users in that sense, that if they use the serious game for a purpose, that should be another perception of the users. So I hope that kind of answered
It does, but it raised a question from Cédric Félicité.
Yeah, John.
Yeah, hi, I'm Cédric Félicité from Solution Brainiac. Sorry for the sound dying. I would like to know, in serious game, I think the experience from the producer, it means the experience in educational and training. He needs to have some experience in teaching, in educational learning.
Yeah, I think I heard you. I had some problems hearing you. There was some noise in the background, but I think the question was the role of the producer and the role of the producer in a serious games project. So we haven't really seen the role of the producer in serious games project so far. We think that that is something that we are exploring, and maybe one of the potential roles of people who graduate from our serious games study program, because they get that kind of knowledge from the courses they take. What are the additional requirements on someone who wants to develop serious games? What does this combination of game design knowledge and other types of competences needed for the serious applications? So I hope that answered the question. So I think that the producer would be a key role and the new kind of producer for serious games, I think.
Okay, because I was thinking to make some producer but from learning field. And mix them with video games developer. Yeah, and I think that I mean, educational games, that is a huge part of the serious games area. I think that educational games, game-based learning and such is probably the biggest application area of serious games, maybe along with games for health also. So for sure, I think there is actually quite much research on educational games and educational game development that you can read up on. So I definitely think that you will need some knowledge also in pedagogy, and above all also, I think that has been our experience in the projects where we have been working with schools and school children, that you need an understanding for the learning context of the players, whether it's played in school or at home, has some meaning. And of course, the pedagogical presentation of the content. So there is a rich body of knowledge. I think that Kathleen Becker wrote a very good book on that, about how to develop and use educational games. So,
And we have another comment from Jonas Collin.
Okay, so my question would be, in recent organizations, we're seeing a pretty important, significant place given to internal players, or i.e. testers. How do you see internal testers in your game developer organization, specifically based on recent organization orientation, where testers, players are becoming more and more important, just actually to determine the experience, as you said it, which is kind of the role of the producer here?
Yeah, it's as you point out, that's challenging, and generally in all our teaching and game development, we encourage iterative development and continuous testing even of early, very crude prototypes, even paper prototypes, to try and capture those aspects. In serious games, and I'll come back to that particular thing in one of the examples that I will share later on, but in serious games, we have also approached that by including, of course, the tester on, or the testing on the target audience with respect to the effect and usefulness, for example, of the game as well. So not only then the gameplay experience, but also the utility. So that is how we try to address it. But iterative development and continuous testing, that is what we strongly advocate in all our study programs.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so then moving back to the eVary picture, then with this as a backdrop, we feel, of course, strongly that there is something missing. I mean, we believe that the marriage that has been proposed by game and utility is not at all that straightforward as sometimes described. That we often feel that the game design knowledge has not been enough appreciated and acknowledged in the IS community part of serious games, that serious games have been much more viewed as an IS product. So something missing. And we introduced them to this picture, the game development domain, as that part being missing. Including then, of course, the view of the users. So users become users, players, IS developers. Well, we introduce several new competences into those teams. So this becomes a new mix. And in the following, I would like to just briefly share and discuss some of the challenges that we have been working with pertaining to this balance between game and utility, and how we have tried to balance it in our different projects. And I'm starting with one of our early projects, one of the first 2 or 3 projects that we did, in fact. And this was a project called Eleanor, which was about stroke rehabilitation. And we did that together with our regional hospital, the neurology rehabilitation unit, and together with researchers from neuroscience in Sahlgrenska Academy in Göteborg. So the goal of this project was to deliver home-based stroke rehabilitation for non-typical gamers. That was like the project vision. And the result was the console that you can see in the picture, as a brand new game console with a physical interaction, and specifically designed or adapted games for that console and for the target audience. So all packed and shipped in a separate console like this. In fact, that idea was based on game cabinets in the 70s, which there's one button, you do one thing, and that's it. So stroke rehabilitation, back to then that we wanted to move into areas where we felt that there was actually a need. It seemed, and we learned, that stroke is a quite common problem, and that the chance of surviving if you're in the Western hemisphere is quite high. And then there is a big need for rehabilitation. And what we learned from our friends at the hospital is that the motivation and interest for rehabilitation drops significantly already after a week or 2. And this is, of course, very problematic, because they know that rehabilitation pays off for months or even years after the stroke. So that is the kind of problem that they approached us with. So this project, we spent around 8 months of production time. So that included hardware and game development. and also a pre-evaluation. And that pre-evaluation was done with nursing students. And that is a little bit of your question, Jonas, that we did not have access to patients to test during development to the extent needed. So we thought that, well, nursing students could be one target group to capture some aspects. And of course, we tested with professionals in the development team. The actual development process utilized a rapid prototyping approach, where we did several versions of both hardware and software, which were continually tested with both professionals and some selected patients who were involved in the development process, and those were relatively healthy patients. So that iterated, and the final result you saw was the cabinet. But for sure, the first versions of the things that we tested did not at all look like that. And we tried to focus much on interactions and on what kind of games that people would possibly appreciate. And during this work, we came to realize that it's actually quite hard to talk about games, game design, and what are games with non-designers or people who are really not that interested or have some background in it. There is a lack of a common language for that. So we came across Staffan Björk. He's a game scholar who formed a game design pattern language for game design, which we were quite inspired by. And that helped us to think in new ways on how to talk about game design with non-experts. So we had some inspiration from that, but it was for sure much about showing, testing, and redoing. The evaluation should be done in a natural environment. That was definitely our goal. And at the time, that was actually a pretty unique setup, because most of the things that we saw when it came to stroke rehabilitation with games were not at all tested in natural environments. And especially not at home, in the homes of patients. So that was an important factor for us. And in total, we had 16 participants participating during 2 5-week sessions. So they were organized like this, that there was a screening test done by the physiotherapist and occupational therapists, an interview by a psychologist, and then we delivered the Eleanor machine to the homes of the participants, and from our side, not much more than that, because one of the things that we wanted to see was whether it actually worked to just deliver it and see if people understood what they could do. And then there was a process.
I have to interrupt you again. I'm sorry. When you started mentioning the rehabilitation, you showed an illustration, but you didn't explain what was going on up there. And let me say, as a semi-neuropsychologist, I want to know what handicaps after a stroke are that you are trying to fix, because this is all too vague and methodological until we have a concrete idea of what you're trying to fix.
So the target was upper extremity rehabilitation, hands and arms. So we did not at all go for the cognitive aspects, which would also have been of course, very interesting given the fact of games. But together with the rehabilitation people, we decided to go for arm rehabilitation, and the selection of patients to participate were then people who had suffered a stroke that came also with left or right hand impairment.
And what movements in particular?
Yeah, so that would be then movements, left, right, up, down, these kinds of movements with the whole arm. Some focus on grip also. So we used something called the ARAT test. That was from the occupational therapists to determine the rehabilitation effect. So that is things like movement and grip.
Okay, that helps. Now we have something concrete in our minds as you speak about the methodology. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's good that you pointed out. I forget I should have included some more detail on that in one of the previous slides. Yeah. Yeah, and then there was a post-test and a follow-up interview to see what had happened. The aspects that we tried to evaluate was, of course, we were very interested in gaming behavior. And for that, we thought that, well, time and maybe impressions of flow experience could be useful. So we used playtime as one way of trying to measure the interest. We delivered the machines without any particular instructions on how much to play or what to do with them. Our hope was that if people play for 10, 15 minutes per day, maybe 5 days a week or something, so roughly an hour a week, that would be a good result. But when we looked at the game logs, that was actually exceeded by far. So I think the playtime was 5 to 6 times higher than we expected. And in fact, the most common complaint was lack of content. And we also found when we talked to patients that they talked about their play experience and they had statements indicating flow experiences and things like that, that was actually shared with the way that gamers talk about their play experience. So we could definitely see that we got to the that part of the game where I felt that, yes, we enjoy this. We play it not because we are doing rehabilitation, but because we want to play, because it's fun. Of course, we wanted to look at rehabilitation effect as already indicated. And for that, we used the action research arm test. That's an ARAT test, which is like a standardized test for assessing upper extremity disability, which comes from the area of occupational therapy and physiotherapy. So that is the kind of measures we looked at. And the results were positive, that they showed a significant improvement in the function between the baseline test, the first test, and the post-test. And even in the follow-up test, which was made 4 months after the baseline test. So that was very positive. And in terms of user acceptance, of course, a system like this has to be acceptable for patients as well as professionals. And it landed well. The healthcare professionals felt that this could probably be a useful tool. They particularly liked the idea of designing a rehabilitation process around it and the possibility to do follow-ups by means of inspection of logs and things like that. And patients, there was also a quite high user acceptance among them. And we used an adapted version of the technology acceptance model to determine that. So to sum up, I think there was at the time many claims concerning game-based rehabilitation in the home, but surprisingly very little empirical evaluation, and we contributed to do that. I think we identify sort of a mid-range segment here. Not high-end systems, which were quite popular. We were with other colleagues that we were working with, which were typically installed at rehabilitation units, but far too expensive and far too complex to use in the home. Then there was a stream towards using commercial games, because this was also at the time when physical interfaces started to appear with games like the Wii, for example. But what we found that those games, they were far too hard in several aspects, not only the games themselves, but also the general setup of the console. We had a vision which we called instant fun, meaning that you should only push a button and then 30 seconds later you should be in the gaming. But that was not at all the case with the Wii console at the time. So the second project I would like to share has a very different character, even though still in the healthcare sector. This was about medical simulation and training, and we were working together with the regional ambulance unit and pre-hospital researchers. And the vision and the goal here in this project was to develop simulated training environment to improve the role play training that was typically used in the ambulance unit. So traditional medical simulation focus on the medical scenario, which makes sense, of course, and they use these kinds of advanced mannequins to train that. But the training facility that they wanted should cater for also the fact that pre-hospital medicine or pre-hospital care takes place in very many different places and contexts. So pre-hospital medical care is something different. And we did that together with them, and we installed the whole solution at the ambulance unit. So that includes the plug and play driving simulator to capture the transportation aspect. It included an adaptable scene room, which was a rebuilt conference room to cater for different scenarios. For example, in workplaces or a workshop or in the home of a patient, you could do different setups quickly with the help of projectors and sound and some simple props. And then, of course, the patient at the center of the scenario, because the patient is what is important, of course, in the caretaking process. But for that, we used the same mannequins that they normally use for training. So the pre-hospital process actually starts, even though we don't really think of it, already when you call for assistance and you end up with the alarm unit. And it ends possibly when the patient is handed off at the hospital. So how can you capture this whole process in a training scenario? And that is something that they struggled much with. So we termed our concept contextualization, meaning that we wanted to capture the whole process, but in an easy and flexible manner. So the scenario starts with the turnout, and then you are in the plug and play driving simulator, and you start the communication with the alarm unit, and you get some information so that you can get into the planning process for what happens when you enter the patient's home, which is here. And what you should do there, what kind of information is available apart from the medical information from the mannequin, and then the loading and handing over at the ER unit. So we wanted to capture the whole process. When we designed the system and evaluated it, we worked with the concept of immersion in serious games to explore what happens when people get very much engaged into the role play experience. So we borrowed the concept of immersion, which is quite popular in the game design community, which says something about the extent to which you get invested in a game. It's sort of similar to flow, but normally people talk about scales from high to low immersion, and it's typically measured through questionnaires. And high immersion is seen as a positive quality of games, since one of the reasons to stay in a game is motivation, immersion. So the likelihood to stay on the task for longer would increase. So when we modeled this, it rather looked like this. The medical treatment scenario includes treatment, caretaking, communication, and transport, and it is done in different places: the scene of the accident, the ambulance, at the hospital. So we tried to go beyond the traditional way of doing this in medical simulation, which is the left picture, and that is that the instructor is in the scenario together with the participants and simply giving instructions. Okay, now you are there, and this has happened, and here is your patient. Please go ahead and inspect the patient. Whereas we felt that adding more of the complexity to the scenario that is relevant to the pre-hospital staff would make sense, and we termed that the contextualized scenario. So we included information that comes from the scenario. For example, there's a lot of information that is represented in the context. When you come to a scene of an accident, for example, sign of drug use can be information that is adding to the interpretation of a symptom. So that is, for example, possible to determine if you are in a certain place. You may find some other things that would shed some additional light to the treatment. We designed 2 medical scenarios, which were then distributed under traditional and contextualized scenario. And then we had 12 professional ambulance teams who tested them to see how they reacted to the 2 versions. Did they become more immersed in the live role-playing activity with our solution than with the traditional one? In fact, we could see that the immersion was higher in the contextualized version of the medical scenario. We moved from only doing questionnaires to designing, together with the pre-hospital care experts, an observational tool to determine the level of immersion, where we looked for certain types of interactions, that is how you interacted with this mannequin, which would be indicators or triggers of higher and lower immersion. We could see that the immersion was actually higher in the contextualized scenario. Then we also did a follow-up study where we looked at performance. And again, we used the standardized performance tool among pre-hospital researchers, where we had independent experts inspecting the videos of these scenarios to see what they thought about, or ask them to judge the performance of the teams. And then it turned out that the teams performed better, especially for the overall clinical performance and situation awareness, which are two important components of this evaluation tool. Within the contextualized scenarios. And the latter, the situation awareness, is one of the things that they pointed out to us is especially important in pre-hospital care. So that's all good. But when we got back to reading about other aspects of game-based training and game-based learning, we saw that immersion is actually sort of a double-edged sword. It can sometimes be detriment to learning because learning requires reflection, and the lack of reflection needed to be solved. And that's a conflict in the sense that reflection is an immersion breaker, which may be problematic from a gameplay perspective. So they don't necessarily go hand in hand.
There's a question related to this from Maul,
yeah.
Which is, would immersion be detached from flow if we factor in growth from the player's perspective? I suppose what she means by growth is what they learn from the exercise.
Yeah. My interpretation is that flow is typically perceived as a positive experience, that you're in the flow, you're in the zone, whereas immersion, at least as it's used in much of the game development community, is rather a matter of level of immersion. So you can be little immersed or more. That would be the main difference. But for sure, the immersion concept and the gameplay immersion concept has borrowed a lot from flow theory, for sure. And of course, it's a drawback that we typically measure it by either questionnaires or, in our case, by observation and questionnaires and interviews. But we have done some experiments with trying to capture psychophysiological signals as well, to see if you can know something about the immersiveness of or the immersion of the player. But
Maul followed up with the question, you seem to be treating flow as all or none, and you seem to be treating immersion as a matter of degree, but isn't there a matter of degree in flow?
Yeah, I would imagine. And we've struggled with this. And as I said, they are probably similar. But my interpretation, again, of flow is that it's definitely a positive experience and of being in the zone. So you're sort of either in the zone or not, whereas immersion is more of a graded thing. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Just a passing remark. I haven't heard anything about psychologists being involved in any of this. Is it all done by technical people and domain experts?
One of the colleagues is a cognitive scientist. In the particular case of the ambulance, we have psychologists working with us in the Eleanor project, but in this project, the team was ourselves and a cognitive scientist.
Well, cognitive scientist is rather general, but okay, I'll take that as a yes.
But with the particular interest in cognitive psychology, I'd say so. Not the strongest part of the development team, but absolutely represented.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So one of the things that we actually found, and that I think is an interesting takeaway, is that this idea of trying to contextualize the scenarios to cater for the whole process rather than only parts of it, as traditionally, actually turned out to be quite useful, because we had several, and also the part where we developed after support, that is technical system support for after action review. We had several instructors describing training situations where critical decisions were discussed, and it turned out that the participants and the instructor did not at all agree on what actually happened. And especially in the traditional way of training, the participants will have to say that, okay, we're done. Whereas we aimed for that, do as you normally do. And when you either leave the patient or drop the patient at the hospital, that's when it's done, or when we end the scenario. And actually, one of the most important decisions that an ambulance nurse has to take is whether to finalize the treatment on site or bring the patient to the hospital. And that particular decision point was not at all captured in the previous ways that they had trained this. So that, I think, was a very practical and useful new piece of knowledge for them. The third project is called Hidden in the Park, and this is about risk awareness, and in particular about risk awareness is about dangerous situations online or in social media, and in especially grooming, which is an exceeding problem, it seems, in many parts of the world. So this was done with the partners from a foundation called Change Attitude, which work against sexual abuse of children, and the Word Childhood Foundation. And the problem we addressed here was how to address sensitive topics in games. So especially for a topic like grooming, which is, according to our partners in the project and the police, even a problem concerning kids as young as 6 or 7 years old, because already then they start to be on different platforms where these things happen. So how do you address this in a serious game? Maybe the answer to that is, well, not at all. There is actually nothing disturbing or frightening in the game, not in the visuals or in the material of the game. But what there is a procedure. So we borrowed this ideas from game scholar Ian Bogost and his ideas of procedural rhetoric, that the message can be in the procedure rather than in the theme of the game. So the game itself is for 4-player. It's a board game combined with the AR. And the game is about hiding a treasure. So each player hides his or her own treasure. And then the game is about finding each other's treasures with the help of different clues that you can earn in different ways. So every player hides his treasure, and it can be found by 4 clues, or the combination of 4 clues will reveal the treasure. So it's a bit like Cluedo. You use the tablet for a variety of things. Of course, it tells you what to do. You use the tablet to hide your treasure. You use the tablet and the AR function to guess where someone has hidden their treasure. And the winner is the one who first finds someone else's treasure. And also with the tablet, you get to play several mini games of different sorts. So suddenly something happens. Through the tablet, you get messages from an unknown participant who starts to ask you for clues and tries to get you to reveal your clues with the help of different strategies. So that can be promises. If you give me a clue, I will do this and that for you. Or bribes. If you give me a clue, I will give you one extra play session at the mini game you like the most, or sometimes even threats that if you don't do this, I will reveal one of the clues to your treasure to the other players. So the unique thing about those procedures, that the things that this hidden player enacts, is that they are all developed based on patterns of how these perpetrators act when they are online. So it's exactly those patterns that were identified from several thousand pages of transcripts of grooming processes from court cases in Sweden. And then the thing is that these patterns, these things, are then the foundation for the teaching manual. So the game comes with a manual that tells you how you as a teacher can work with and discuss those situations. How can you recognize them? How can you see when these patterns occur? So the learning is in that the procedures are in the game, but the transfer to other situations and the discussion of the sensitive parts of the topic is all with the teacher. So apart from inspiration from procedural rhetoric, we also looked at the work of a game designer called Brenda Romero. She has a vision where she says that the mechanic is the message. That is, what you do in the game has some meaning. And she has a very famous example in her train game, which is a roll and dice games, and you select actions to pack and transport the pawns of the game as effectively and efficient as possible. And then after some time, it turns out that you're actually loading and transporting prisoners to a concentration camp. And then, of course, the whole game changes and creates awareness of something completely different that was not at all on the board from the beginning. So that was also a source of inspiration, I think. So we learned that it worked well with the tests with teachers. The AR thing was actually quite nice as a wow factor, but who knows how long AR is a wow factor? Probably not for long. And that is, I guess, the problem with trusting the wow factor too much in serious games, that they will grow old very quickly. But using the context and the teacher as a resource for a serious purpose, and the teacher manual is a key factor for that. That proved to be a good way, a successful way of doing that in this context. We really learned that it's very important to put the game into some kind of context to create the meaning and discussion and interpretation of these mechanics and procedures with the kids. And we utilize that strategy with the teachers then. So I think that the three cases can be summarized like this, that you have utility axis and you have a gameplay axis. And that somehow it should be a sort of balance between gameplay and utility. What we found typically when we meet with clients and participants and co-workers from different areas is that they very much worry about, and of course they do, about utility, which can be interpreted as in this well, not a game. They're not really into that part of it. Whereas the other dimension, the gameplay experience, typically resides completely on the development team then. Or if there is an optimal solution to this dilemma. So if we look at the different projects on this space, I'd say that the Sarek game, well, it's almost all about utility. We did not really do much game design there. I think that the enhancement of the approach to role-playing and that the scenarios were perceived as more vivid and interesting, that was the gameplay experience. I think that we managed to increase the level of their gameplay by introducing this contextualization and by taking the instructor out of the actual scenario enactment. Hidden in the Park sort of resides on the other end, a high focus on designing an attractive game, but where context is everything to provide the support for how to use it when addressing the topic. And the Eleanor possibly in the middle, where we somehow struck a pretty good combination of the two. But according to our experience from these and several other projects, this is likely to be very hard and very costly. So probably it's better to aim for some of the other combinations rather than this one at the upper right corner with high gameplay experience and high utilities. Yeah, hard. Yeah, I think that I will close my talk somewhere here, saying that we summarize this in a couple of principles, where some of them are rooted in several projects and where some are really strong in particular projects. And these are the materials that I have used. And if you want to read particularly about the, particularly about the design principles, they are summarized in this paper, the fourth reference by Henrik Engström and myself. And then some other pointers to materials and inspirations as well as our own papers and reports where you can get more of the details if you're interested in those details. So with that, I think, thank you for your attention.
So with that, I want to thank Professor Backlund very much for an interesting and stimulating talk, and come back next week for the next talk. Thank you, Per.
Thank you. Thank you for listening.
Bye-bye.